So we've just taken a bit of a tour of pesticides and Roundup. Vandana, can you give us the foundation of understanding about GMOs and what you want this audience to know about GMOs?
I think the first issue about GMOs is that it is an experimental technique. And I'll talk much more detail about this tomorrow. I was at a meeting in '87 where the industry laid out very clearly that their objective was patenting seed. They had done no GMOs. But in the public universities, the techniques of recombinant DNA had been evolved, and the scientists in the US had even called for a moratorium. It was called a moratorium at the Asilomar Convention in the 70s, I think, no? And then industry found that here's a tool, and now we can pretend that we are inventing life. I won't go too much into detail on that side, but the three aspects of the GMO issue that need to be known by anyone concerned with health. The first is there are only two applications after all these years. I remember in the 80s when I used to debate the industry, they used to talk about how with genetic engineering they'd be able to grow food on the moon, in the Sahara Desert, and on toxic dumps. And all you have is the Bt crops where a toxin is put into the crop, and the herbicide-tolerant crops. Only two applications are the commercially spread applications. Often, on and off, there'll be some news of something, but a book waiting to be written is all the miracles that failed. I remember the first GM crop was actually something called the flavor saver tomato. Now, this tomato didn't have a movement to stop it. It just stopped itself because it was so bad. It was really removing the genes that would allow the tomato to show it was now a rotten tomato. I call it the Botox tomato. Because just like, people put poison, they paralyze their, what is it called? This thing we get when we age.
Wrinkles.
The wrinkles, right. The dignity of age. They wanted to get rid of the wrinkles, so they started to Botox. In a way, the flavor saver tomato was a rotten tomato looking young. That's why I call it the Botox tomato. And I remember in those days, Jeremy Rifkin was very active in the GMO debate, and at a press conference, he threw a flavor saver tomato against the wall, and it bounced right back like a ball, because that's what it was designed. But the point is, you want to cook with a tomato, you want to have a tomato that doesn't cook sitting in your pan. So it was rejected just for its badness as a food. I've since then met some of the scientists who'd worked on it. I think it was Calgene, yes. Which was bought up by Monsanto later. Interestingly, Monsanto has done no original work in genetic engineering. All it does is finds a company that's done some work, sues them, tires them out, and buys them out. The Bt cotton, Agrocetus. Even the soya, they sued Agrocetus, Agrocetus said, okay, we'll sell to you. Because the costs become so high in these long litigations. So how does the Bt crop work? The soil anyway has naturally occurring trillions of bacteria. And there's one called Bacillus thuringiensis. That's where the word Bt comes from. It produces an endotoxin, which becomes a toxin in the gut of the caterpillar family of insects. It's not toxic to humans or other animals and other species. But when they pull out the gene to express this toxin and now put it into a plant, it's actually a very, very different thing. That's why the fundamental assumption that was started by the US. And maybe I should tell this story because in the 80s, we were working on a convention on biological diversity. There are 2 UN treaties. One is for climate change, which is called the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. The other is the Biodiversity Convention. One is to protect species, the other is to avoid catastrophic climate change. I was asked by my government to be an advisor, and I started to go to the biodiversity meetings. My government, I said, whom are you sending as your lead negotiator? Oh, the head of Project Tiger. Because they thought biodiversity is about tigers and elephants, no? I said, no, this is about anything that lives and will be turned into the green oil of the future. Just like fossil fuels were turned into oil, the last century that gave us climate change. So I started to go and I started to talk to governments about what was coming with genetic engineering, and we managed to put into it a clause, Article 19.3, which says all governments have an obligation to assess the impact of GMOs on living organisms and biodiversity. This clause was called the Biosafety Clause, out of which grew the Cartagena Protocol. Now, I remember President Bush walked out of signing this convention, said, I won't allow my $50 billion industry, the biotech industry, to go down the drain, as if safety interferes in good business. It should interfere in bad business where you're trying to sell something unsafe as safe. And that's why in this country you never had proper biosafety regulations from the very beginning. There was a vice president who could not spell potato. You remember him? Well, he could spell the word substantial equivalence. Much more complicated than potato. Because the assumption was made right after Rio, assume that the genetically modified organism is the same as the non-genetically modified organism. And I call this the don't look, don't see, don't find policy, which is why most deep studies have come out of Europe and not out of this country. Because no one looks. And I remember I was doing a meeting in Delhi, and one of your officials from the USDA came, and they're always keeping track of what I do. I said, welcome, you're very welcome to keep track. I'm sure they're listening anyway today. And he dropped in, and I said, why don't you speak? It was a biotechnology meeting. I was training the government of India on biotechnology. And he talked about how approvals are given. The company sends a postcard saying we are doing a trial. They don't even tell you where. The government doesn't go and check. Indian laws are far more stringent. The government is obliged to do the trials and supervise the trials, and only when the trials show that there isn't an impact. So what is this new word that was created under the Convention on Biological Diversity? It is called biosafety, safety in the era of genetic engineering. And it had 2 elements, but in India we've added a 3rd element. The first element is the impact on environment, the impact on biodiversity, which is why it is in the Biodiversity Convention. The second impact is the impact on public health. And because it also has impacts on farmers, we've added an element of socioeconomic impact, which should have also been done in this country because farmers really have suffered, the GMO farmers. And I remember in '92 when the first commercialization of GM soya happened, and I was on a tour, and I asked this farmer I met, I said, why are you growing this stuff? He said, the industry has a noose now around our neck. We grow what they ask us to grow. Because not only are the farmers indebted and locked in, but even the market is fixed according to what they want to trade in. So the Bt toxin was declared safe under this very false assumption of substantial equivalence. It's a very different toxin. It's a ready-made toxin, and now it's toxic to animals and humans. 1,200 animals died feeding on cotton, Bt cotton, in India, and the regional government said it was poisoning because of the toxin, the central government by then had been influenced and never did the proper assessments. We've done studies on pollinators, not one pollinator on a Bt toxin crop, not one. Because the pollen, the cell, the leaf, everything is releasing the toxin. Down in the soil, we did a study after 4 years of planting, 20% beneficial organisms had died. We did a study on 10 years of planting of Bt cotton, 66% beneficial organisms were done. So we're literally killing the soil, killing the pollinators, killing animals where they're eating directly, because grazing has been part of Indian culture. The second group of crops is the herbicide-resistant, the Roundup-ready crops being one. But they've tried recently in India to push for a glufosinate-tolerant mustard. Bayer has glufosinate, which is sold as Basta, like the Monsanto glyphosate. We have cases, many of my cases are still in the Supreme Court, and a technical expert committee was set up by the Indian Supreme Court of the top heads of public institutions dealing with molecular biology and genetic engineering. Absolutely the heads of the toxicology lab, the molecular biology lab, and they were put together by the Supreme Court to say, we don't know this technical stuff, you advise us on safety. And they made 3 points. The Bt crops should have a moratorium for 10 years while we do further studies. By the way, they tried to bring a Bt aubergine in India. Eggplant, which was then sneaked into Bangladesh. But our minister of that time, we were all writing to him, and he did something absolutely fascinating. He organized public hearings in 7 cities on the eggplant, as it is the first time a vegetable has been a subject of democracy at such a high level. And at the end of it, he was telling the Monsanto guys, he says, you're so stupid, you come in the same yellow t-shirts. And you turn up, the same 10 guys turn up at every hearing. He says, I recognize you, you don't get a chance to speak. The Bt wasn't needed because there was no caterpillar pest. We have surplus of aubergine. We have 4,500 varieties. 4,500 varieties of eggplant. India is the home of eggplant, as so many other crops. That was stopped, so only Bt cotton is there. The only new one would have been the aubergine. The technical expert committee said Bt should be assessed. Herbicide resistance should just not be allowed because our farms are on an average 2-acre farms with lots of diversity. And a herbicide-tolerant crop means you kill the diversity, which is food for people, for animals. And the third thing that they recommended was that we need a very robust scientific system independent of industry to be able to deliver the assessments. And it will not take less than 10 years to get this done. Those issues are still in our courts. Monsanto is in the courts, not just in India, in many places. I think we really need to consolidate much more how much illegality they engage in as their normal practice, but abnormal practice for the country where they have entered, because there are too many violations of biosafety, and there are too many violations also of intellectual property. But I'll talk more about that tomorrow.
So I'm going to fill in some information about GMOs that I find fascinating, and that is the process of genetic engineering. They literally used a .22 caliber gun in the original ways that they genetically engineered crops. And then they turned it into a gene gun, and it actually looks like a gun in some cases, where they take, for example, the gene from soil bacteria, the Bt that produces this toxin, and they make millions of copies and put them on coated tungsten or gold pellets, particles, and they shoot the gun into a plate of cells, hoping that some of the genes make it into the DNA of some of those cells. And then they grow the cells through cloning into a crop so that every cell of that GMO now has a little gene-sized spray bottle of that BT, and it's produced in every cell. Or they use bacteria to infect the cells, and then of course they clone it. Now the process of genetic engineering causes hundreds or thousands of mutations up and down the DNA, any one of which could create a toxin or an allergen or an anti-nutrient or a carcinogen. And it's disruptive and it's dangerous and it's unprecedented and it's not even evaluated. The companies have not in the past sequenced the DNA of the crops they introduced. They didn't even sequence the proteins to see if they were what they were looking for. Now, there was a man named Dr. Arpad Pusztai, a Hungarian scientist who worked in the Rowett Institute in Aberdeen, Scotland. He was the top scientist in the world in his field. And he was given about $3 million by the UK government to figure out how to test for the safety of GMOs. And his protocols were supposed to be implemented into the European GMO assessment protocols. He was a pro-GMO scientist. He created the protocols with teams from 3 different institutions, about 20 or 30 people, and they decided to put a group of rats, through the testing protocols with a GMO that they knew was safe. It was a potato that they were going to be commercializing. The potato was going to create this lectin protein that was going to kill the potato beetle. And Dr. Pusztai created the entire field of lectins. He had studied lectins more than anyone else, and this particular lectin that was being produced by the protein was the one he had studied more than anything. And he knew that even under high concentrations, it would have no effect or very little effect on the rats. So what he did was he fed the group of rats the genetically engineered potato that produced this insecticidal lectin. But he fed another group of rats the non-GMO potato, and a third group of rats, and here's the brilliance, the non-GMO potato plus spraying into the food the lectins, the same amount of the lectins that was produced by the GMO. So the non-GMO potato plus the lectins, the GMO potato that produced the lectins, and the non-GMO potato. Only the group that ate the GMO potato that produced its own lectins had potentially precancerous cell growth in the digestive tract, smaller brains, livers, and testicles, partial atrophy of the liver, and damaged immune system in just 10 days. It was not the group that ate the potatoes with the added lectin. It was not the insecticide that caused the problem. It was the process of genetic engineering, the disruptive process, the generic process that caused the damage to the rats. And he was shocked because he had been given the unusual and rare privilege of reading the submissions to the UK government by the biotech industry that got their GMOs approved, and realized that they never looked at this level of detail, that his potatoes would have made it onto the market and were supposed to be going to the market had he not done these research studies. And he realized that it was the generic process of genetic engineering that caused the problem, and that the same GMOs already on the market use that same generic process and could be causing the damage throughout the population. And there's a story in my book, Seeds of Deception, how when he went public, he was a hero for 2 days at his institute, and then call from the Prime Minister's office, then another call, and the next day he was fired from his job after 35 years and silenced with threats of a lawsuit. And it goes on, and eventually he was able to speak, and when he was able to speak, a revolution in the press ultimately resulted in the tipping point of consumer rejection against GMOs in Europe. And that's why Europe kicked out GMOs, because of the the strength and bravery of this man. But it shows that the process of genetic engineering is inherently dangerous.
Could I say something in supplement? On Dr. Arpat Putsa, I remember we called him to India and gave him a Gandhi Award. And he eventually went back to Hungary, and he's made Hungary GMO-free. And he said, I left Hungary as a refugee during the war for freedom. I'm going back to Hungary for freedom. And Tony Blair was the Prime Minister of the US, but he got a call from Clinton, who got a call from Monsanto.
Who then called the Rowett Institute, which resulted in the firing of Arpad Pusztai.
And for those of you who want to see a little more on, how President Bush or President Clinton or anyone, President Obama said he'd do labeling, and he didn't ever complete that promise. This film by a French journalist called The World According to Monsanto, it's got some nice clips of President Bush visiting the Monsanto headquarters and saying, tell me what you want done. That's the way I'll write the laws. It's there. But on the the making of the genetically engineered organism, you got the gene gun and the bacterial thing. But because it's such an uncertain technology, you're just shooting in the dark. And you don't know whether a cell will absorb the gene you want to introduce. So they also act an antibiotic resistance marker so that on the Petri dish they can pour in antibiotics, and only the successful GMO is selected, others die because of the antibiotics resistance. And because it's in the nature of all living systems to reject what isn't part of that system, when we do organ transplant, there are lots and lots of drugs that have to be added. In this case, what's added to allow the acceptance of the introduced gene and allow its expression are viral promoters. So two big public health problems, antibiotic resistance. Every GMO has antibiotic resistance markers in it. Every GMO. It doesn't just come from chicken in the factory farms. And the new epidemics of new viruses, a lot of scientists have said, are coming from the hybridization of the viruses that are used as promoters and the viruses in our gut. I got a letter from a Chinese scientist when the SARS epidemic broke. You remember? And he said, we are feeding all our animals GMO soya, and it could so easily be this horizontal gene transfer is happening, and the animals are developing superviruses, which are then jumping from animals to humans. This also, some people have said, is related to the H1N1, which are very lethal viruses compared to the earlier viruses. Again, because the chemical industry, the GM industry, and the pharmaceutical industry is one industry, for them it's wonderful there's more diseases. It's a very good, successful business model. But for the people, it's not.
I just, not to be a pain in the ass, but I just want to, there's a misconception that Europe is GMO free. That's not accurate. I spent, the middle section of my book is all about Europe, and I spent quite a bit of time traveling around. And one of the revelations of my time in Europe was working with a minister of food who was actually involved in writing the laws. And so because of some of the, like TTIP, the the partnership between America and the European Union, animal feed, for instance, is all GMO still. So a lot of European people think that they're not eating GMOs, where in fact milk and meat, dairy, and eggs all may contain GMOs if they're analyzed, because the grain doesn't, the GMOs and the pesticides that are used on GMOs will still be in those products. Also, Spain is wall-to-wall GMO corn. Spain is hook, line, and sinker, grows this stuff. So does Portugal. There are other European countries which have stricter laws, but that doesn't mean they aren't growing any GMOs. So, I was really interested in this idea of the grass being greener across the Atlantic, and found that actually it was way more complicated, and that what's actually, if there's, I don't know what's worse, but in some ways, this one food minister who I was interviewing did say that he did feel that the European people had been duped into thinking that they were eating GMO-free everywhere, and indeed they were not, and not all of their food was GMO-free, and these were sort of lies that were stacked in a way to make people feel that Europe had rejected something which they indeed had not, because all animal feed is coming from either South America or the United States, and it's all GMO. So I just wanted to correct that.
And I'll go a little bit further and give some detail. On April 27th, 1999, 10 weeks after Arpad Pusztai's gag order was lifted and hundreds of articles were written, Unilever committed to stop using GMO ingredients, direct ingredients, not animal feed, for the European customers. The next day, Nestle said the same thing, and then within a week or two, virtually everyone capitulated. But it wasn't in terms of animal feed. And there's now a labeling law that's real and true in Europe, and so you very, very rarely see something that says made with GMO ingredients, because they already banned not the political side, but the food companies stopped using it because of the concern by consumers. But more than 50% of the animal feed is, in fact, GMO. But there's a bunch of retailers that committed that certain of their animal products would be non-GMO, and some of them have kept that up. So there's a lively trade of millions of metric tons of non-GMO soy going from states like Paraná in Brazil to feed the animals in Europe in a non-GMO way. But it's true that they don't even know that they're eating animals that have been fed GMOs. And I didn't get that it was wall to wall in Spain, although I haven't been there. I had heard a certain number of hectares, but if you visited and it's wall to wall, then I have to.
Well, from what I understand, the Spanish government is, I don't know, but you both know, that the Spanish government and the Portuguese have made incredible concessions to the biotech companies into growing and to testing products as well, to field testing, and
so I think
it sounds like
it's primarily corn.
Right, it's all corn.
And I was advising the Environment Ministry of Spain. One of the new tricks is to destroy environment ministries and to make everything come under the Agriculture Ministry. It happened in Spain. The Environment Ministry was closed.
Right.
It's exactly right now happened in Brazil, where the Environment Ministry has been dissolved, and the Amazon will now be protected by the Agriculture Ministry, chopping down the last tree for GMO soya. That's why I always say plant-based isn't enough, because it's chopping down the Amazon and glyphosate-sprayed soya. It's neither done the planet good, nor has it done your health much good.
Right. That's what I always
And in WikiLeaks, the ambassador to Spain, the U.S. ambassador, said he had just met with the Monsanto representative in the region, and he wants the U.S. to help Spain with a pro-GMO policy and to put pressure on Brussels to be more pro-GMO. So this is a U.S. ambassador basically working on behalf of Monsanto.
And just one other thing. So Europe's biosafety laws are European level. And of course, they're member states. But the biosafety was a European system. The UK was used by the United States to call for national laws and opting out of the European level. And there was a vote, and Britain was one, and there was, I think, one more country, they did not get a majority doing an opt-out. But they used this leak in the European level safety regulation to then start really putting pressure on the Brexit. So while Brexit is, on the one hand, the fear of immigration, which is growing everywhere, but on the other hand, it is about getting out of the European regulations and deregulating. And there's a very big debate in England.
There's also, what I've also understood is that way a lot more American products can be sold in England.
Yes.
Exactly.
That's the point. TIP is not yet. Yeah,
so
the Trans-Pacific Partnership hasn't yet been agreed as a final
American
thing.
food
But the
and
big
products.
pressure, the one that has been agreed to is CETA, where the Canadians are being used. Things go from here, in the name of a Canadian company or Monsanto Canada, and flood the market. And I remember my colleagues had a pasta protest to say, we don't want glyphosate sprayed wheat when we have good enough wheat. So there's a desperation to unwind the regulatory system of Europe and what they call harmonize, which is to bring to zero. Right. They call it harmonization of the food safety and the biosafety laws.
I think, Jeff, can I
Please,
add on
jump
just
in.
a moment on that? I think that all of this has one sort of foundational point to it, which is that you hear from Monsanto and DuPont and the others that, hey, we're just giving the farmers what they want. The farmers wouldn't buy them if they didn't want it. The demand is there and we're just filling a need. And what you have talked about and what I found out in my book is that both on a very small level here in the United States and on a very big level, that's not really the case. They create the product and they push it literally down the throats of those who don't want it. And with Europe, our U.S. filed a complaint, a trade complaint, a WTO trade complaint to try to force Europe to take GMOs. And import GMOs. And, I was astounded when I was like, why are we forcing, what are we doing? What are we trying to do to force other countries, And I was also astounded to learn that our USDA, which maybe it's not surprising to anybody else, but it was to me, I was naive, I suppose. I thought they were supposed to really regulate agriculture and sort of protect us and, but really one of their primary jobs is to advocate for agriculture, and that means advocate for big agricultural companies. And that's what they do. They promote the products of the very big companies, both in the United States and around the world. Our U.S. State Department gets involved in promoting GMOs around the world, which just seems crazy to me. But
it's crazy. So I had a whole section in my book about that with Shelley Pingree, our congresswoman, was talking about the trade deals and how the trade deals were working and how mind-boggling insane it was. And for her going to these meetings and trying to hold a line and saying, wait a minute, we can't capitulate on this and this and this and give this and try for this and negotiate for this and have anything stay at all honest here.
Yeah.
But it's interesting what you're talking about. It kind of goes both ways, though. I mean, it's all about making money. So recently, I've been really interested in. My book came out over 2 years ago, and I'm working on a novel actually. So this, in some ways, feels a little bit like old dusty news to me. A little bit the stuff in my book, but I've been recently really interested in tea. And tea bags in particular. I don't know if you've all noticed that tea bags are often, lately, they're made of plastic. Like, don't drink any tea from Starbucks because it's actually in a plastic bag that you're putting in boiling hot water, and all of those chemicals that are made from petroleum products, but all of those chemicals are leaching into your tea. It's terrifying to me, the amount of ways that we come up with to use plastic, right? And by the way, that's connected to the GMO issue because a lot of plastics are made from GMO corn. But anyway, the Yorkshire Tea Company that makes this really great tea called Yorkshire Gold that my husband likes a lot, I was recently researching tea bags and what are tea bags made of, and I emailed them. the UK, and I said, so what are your tea bags made of? And they said, oh, well, for the US market, we seal them with this. It was a kind of epoxy, like you would make an aircraft carrier. You would seal some things together for it to fly through the air. And I said, oh, well, that's, you're putting that in hot water. So what do you do for the UK market? Oh, we use something totally different. We use a plant-based adhesive that's been tested in all these different ways. So it's just so interesting what is assumed that Americans don't care about. We have nobody to look at it. We are totally happy to help the Yorkshire Tea Company make more money stateside by selling a cheaper product here that may be dangerous to our health. And I just feel like these negotiations back and forth between nations that have to do with our food and the basic things we need to survive, but are all about making money, that is so corrupt and terrifying to me that it's that insidious. Loose tea is the answer in a teapot.
Should I, a little more?
It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if it's organic.
Jump in if you want. It's a discussion.
Well, but it doesn't matter. The tea bag itself is the issue. So what they put to seal it. Well, you have to. What's really interesting about tea is the tea bags. Actually, there are resins that are used in different kinds, and they have all different. I don't know. We could go down this rabbit hole for a long time, but what's that? Even the paper ones are all sealed with a resin, which is what I was trying to say. So even your favorite companies, it depends on what they've used. Yeah.
Well, let's not take questions
there are
right
no
now.
questions, yeah.
We can talk about tea later. You can corner me and we can talk about tea. But all I can tell you is loose tea in a teapot is the way to go.
So most people didn't notice that in the year 1995 and 10 years leading up to 1995, an international regulatory system for free trade was institutionalized as the World Trade Organization, negotiated 10 years before that as the GATT, the General Agreement of Trade and Tariffs, as called the Uruguay Round. Now, it isn't that we didn't have trade agreements before or we didn't have trade before. India was the country that attracted all the colonization, including poor Christopher Columbus, who thought he landed in India when he landed here, and therefore the First Nations here are called Indians. Of course, the East India Company, a little later. The first free trade agreement is East India Company with the Mughals. And it was basically no taxation for the British and heavy taxation for the local produce. Same thing that happens again and again. Now, there are 3 agreements in the WTO that directly affect what we eat. The first is intellectual property, and I'll go into depth tomorrow. The second is the agriculture agreement, which is allowing the likes of Cargill to take over our food system. And when they came into India and tried to destroy our food system, and they put ads, again, we use 70 processes so that your flour can sit for 6 months. Mm-hmm. I did a campaign, and they called their brand Nature Fresh. I did a campaign with kids. I said, what can be nature fresh if there's 70 chemicals? Tell us what the chemicals are. They allowed to use sawdust as fiber, iron filings. It's all in the allowed things. They didn't just flood India with this so-called nature fresh. They worked to manipulate, to shut down our local flour mills. Every corner, we'd go with our grain and have the mill. Every corner till the 90s. 98 was the year. And the same year, Monsanto Cargill worked together using, again, fraudulent safety measures to shut down all our virgin cold press mills. So, the third treaty is related to this issue of safety. It's got a name called Sanitary and Phytosanitary Agreement. This is the agreement that's constantly used to water down safety systems in other countries by the United States. This was the agreement that was used because in the early 2000, especially after Putzai, Europe was having more and more bans and moratoria on GMOs. And Monsanto used President Bush Jr. to file a case against Europe in the WTO. I was in this country doing a biodevastation meeting. There used to be these lovely gatherings we had called biodevastation. And I heard about this. And I immediately said we got to organize a campaign, the Citizens Campaign on GMOs, Global Citizens Campaign. And we wrote to everyone. We said this is not about Europe versus US. It is about Monsanto versus the citizens of the world. And we did a campaign and collected 30 million signatures, which we handed over to WTO. And the campaign basically said, if you rule in favor of the US, which means for Monsanto, you're ruling against our right to health and right to know. And we will dismantle the WTO. They never gave a ruling. They never removed the bans and the moratoria. And then, of course, the European legislation evolved out of this. But I'm saying this to show that civic action in solidarity is a very important force. And wherever it has been used, this poison cartel has had to retreat. It's when it hasn't been used that they keep using their illegal systems to invade more of our food spaces.
Could I jump in there just with wheat? I want to talk about the example of wheat. I don't know if anybody knows how hard Monsanto tried to bring a GMO wheat to market at all. I mean, but I think that's a good example of what you just said. The wheat industry, and this was in the early 2000s, and Monsanto was hoping to do what it did with soybeans and corn and cotton and introduce a genetically engineered Roundup Ready wheat. And, I covered the wheat market, I covered the futures market, I covered cash. I was out in the fields with the farmers who grew the wheat, and I traversed hundreds of farm fields talking to farmers. And what I found out, and I started going to meetings with Monsanto and the wheat growers, and what it became very clear is wheat farmers really didn't want Roundup Ready wheat. They really did not want Roundup Ready wheat. And Monsanto really wanted them to want Roundup Ready wheat. And you had this just sort of strange conversations going on that became increasingly political, as well as sort of threatening to the wheat industry. And Monsanto, arm twisted and tried to get people appointed to committees and tried to do all of these things. And they had developed a Roundup Ready wheat and it was ready to go, and they were going to introduce it. And foreign markets started saying, you know what, you do that, we're not going to buy any more American wheat. And our U.S. farmers were very afraid that they were going to lose their export markets, and it became a very big deal. But Monsanto was determined that they were going to roll out this Roundup Ready wheat, and they started threatening the farmers. And the farmers were saying, what we really could use, if you're going to do something for us, is a disease-resistant wheat. Spring wheat growers in particular, they weren't opposed to biotech by any means. They just didn't need to spray their wheat with Roundup. But they were having problems with disease. And they said, why don't you work on a genetic technology that'll help us fight this disease? And Monsanto said, yeah, no. Maybe we'll do that for you later down the road, but we want to sell you Roundup Ready wheat. And this became, it became a very, very big deal. And I don't know, I feel like maybe I had a small part in, I don't know, but I was sitting down with the CEO of Monsanto as all of this sort of was happening, and I said, what are you doing? What are you doing? They don't want it. Foreign markets don't want it. You introduce it, foreign markets don't buy it. Wheat market, crashes, and it's all going to be on you guys. What are you doing? And within a couple of months, they said they were going to shelve Roundup Ready wheat. And they have, and there still is not a Roundup Ready wheat out there. But it just illustrated for me, and I wrote about that in my book, and there were a lot of internal documents laid out. It wasn't about the farmer. It wasn't about helping the farmer. It wasn't about what the farmer wanted or what the farmer needed. It wasn't about growing more food, feeding the world. It was about selling more chemicals. And I think that is the most clear example of all about what all of this is about. Pressure on Europe, pressure on foreign markets, pressure on farmers. It's not about feeding the world. It's about selling more chemicals.
it's interesting that when Monsanto dropped the wheat, I think it was May 10th, 2004, as they announced it, all of the wheat associations were against it. But I have seen some internal documents and knew that Monsanto was not willing to take no for an answer, and they actually infiltrated the different wheat organizations,
They did, yeah.
which are now calling for GMO wheat. The same company, the same organizations that were against it. And they have an interesting way, and I know that Vandana probably has a similar situation. When we travel around the world and visit different activists and we give the lay of the land, they'll tell us which ministries are owned by Monsanto, now Bayer, which ministers are working on their behest and which ones are reasonable. And I find that the ones that are working on their behest, I can't meet with because they've been told don't meet with Jeffrey Smith. But the ones that are open-minded, I can meet with and give the details. So it's amazing how much pressure and capacity they have around the world.
Can we talk just quickly, can I tell the story of the European Union and what
Please.
went down? I don't know if people know, but in the fall of 2017, the European Union, glyphosate's license in Europe was expiring, and so they were trying to, I mentioned this earlier, which is why I was called to testify, had to determine whether or not to vote to re-register glyphosate, and they had actually already delayed for, I think, a year and a half because the European states were so divided on this issue, and they could not get a qualified majority of European states to agree. They had to have a certain, number. It's based on population and that sort of thing. And they were coming down to the wire when the license was expiring in December, and they had to have another vote, and they had to have a count, and they still couldn't get it, and this went on and on. They could not get a qualified majority. And Germany, which would be a huge swing vote, which was where Bayer is based, and this was before Bayer bought Monsanto, but when they wanted to buy them, but Germany was going to abstain, and they said, we don't agree. Our ministers do not agree on this, and so we are abstaining. And this went down to the wire. They didn't have a qualified majority, and then all of a sudden, at the last minute, the ag minister in Germany came in and swung the vote in favor of re-registering glyphosate.
An interim guy.
Without approval of the rest of the government. And it shocked everybody, and Angela Merkel was furious, and there was a big outrage, but his vote carried the day, and glyphosate was re-registered and reauthorized for the market, only for 5 years, not for the extended period that Monsanto wanted. But, again, that just illustrates the political power.
It's so interesting because in Germany, there's so many people in Germany were against it. Yeah.
Yeah. So many
we're
leaders
fighting so hard.
So many leaders in the government there.
Yeah.
But this one, individual is able to come in and offer that vote to keep it on the market.
Yeah.
I one time talked to a person who, I can't tell you which country because he told me in confidence, but he was in charge of making the determination whether the country was going to take GMOs. And he said that in the first meeting with Monsanto's representative said, and after you approve it, you're going to get a very, very well-paid job. We'll get you a very well-paid job. No, but let's get back to the approvals. And he refused. Unfortunately, he's not in the position anymore, and the government did cave. So we have about 8 minutes before we wrap up, and there's 4 of us, so that gives us a couple of minutes each to give any remarks that we want to add. Who would like to begin? Why don't you start?
Do we not want to do questions? No?
I think, Stephen, you haven't asked me last night not to do questions because it's being live broadcast and it's a little hard to get the. Do you want to do questions from the audience? All right, because I was going under the assumption that you did not want to because that's what it was last night. Do we want to end right at 9:30? Okay.
God, no, we need to end at 9:30.
I think we have some tired.
I have to get up early and fly back to my Eden of Maine. So we could do it either way. We could each take 2 questions. How about that?
I'm always far more interested in what
They
the
have
audience
All right,
has
that's
to say
fine.
Me too.
than
How
what you guys
about
have to
each?
say.
I'll take. I can start, and if there are 2 questions for me, I'll take them. And
All right.
then we can go
I
down
tell you
the line.
what, you got 2 minutes. You could take it as questions or your.
Or my statement. I'll take them as questions. I'd far prefer to hear from you. Oh my God, so there's so many of you. You'll have to give some of them to Carey. Yes.
Take the microphone, please.
Shoot, we can't hear you. I can repeat your question if you.
Oh, it'll work. They'll just turn it on.
Besides Maine,
Besides Maine.
are there any other states in the union that you would recommend maybe we could move to that are the most organic and the most conscious? You know, cities, states, or even countries. Who's like the leading progressive?
Where do I dream about going? The problem is I don't think we're safe anywhere because, you know, one of the things I talk about in my book is rainfall, you know, pesticides being carried by clouds, a study that the National Geologic Survey did, even with, you know, the most buffered place, our soil, our water, our rain, and we've got climate change and we have the threat of nuclear war. So, you know, you pick your thing right now. I mean, you know, Vermont is a great state. There's a lot going on in Vermont. There are great wild places still in Canada. But we can't run away from what has happened here. The only thing we can do now is put our feet on the ground and start really working together to clean up the mess we've made. And as much as I would like to run away too and run away with my children, I don't know where to go. So, yeah. And don't come to Maine. Please don't come. Yeah, one more. Oh, well, I said they could have two questions. So let me just do the next question. Yeah. The tea bags that seem like they're made out of?
Like a fabric? They're not. They're plastic?
Yes.
Whoa.
Vinyl.
They feel like gauze, right? But it's not? Like the
Most of the time, no. You just have to call that tea company, but a lot of them are plastic. I mean, there are some that are made out of organic cotton, you know, but that requires more digging. Yeah.
All right, next question for Vandana or Carey. Right over here.
Thank you. Please. Okay, does the European Union have any kind of a stamp, like we look for the USDA, we look for specific symbols when we buy food that it's organic? Is there anything like that in the European Union, Italy especially?
You know, they have many organic labels, and bio is the word they use.
To be trusted?
More trusted than out here.
Thank you.
But I just want to say to the last question, I think one thing Americans will have to stop doing is wanting to run away. You have to just join hands with us to keep the dirty stuff out from India and here and every other country.
Mm-hmm. Okay, who has the, there's someone raising their hand there.
Hi. Monsanto is such a villainous company, the way it's been painted. Why isn't there more information out there? You're exposing it all, but I mean, you know, I'm an avid reader of the New York Times, and I rarely read about Monsanto. Why isn't the public just made more aware of what is going on?
Go ahead, Carey.
Well, I mean, you know, from where I sit, you know, I'm doing my part. I don't know. I think there are many answers to that question. There's a lot of other things to write about in the world, right? I mean, there are a lot of things going on. I think the New York Times has done a pretty good job about this. I mean, Eric Lipton did a very big story in 2015. He used emails that my organization I work for now, I left Reuters, I work for US Right to Know now. It's a nonprofit, and pretty much all I do now is file freedom of information request. My colleagues do the same, and that's what we do.
Danny Hakam did that huge piece in the fall of 2016.
Eric Lipton did a
Danny did a
Danny's
big
done a piece, but Eric Lipton did a very big expose on you know, what's been going on secretly with all of these emails and Monsanto paying academics. He's been sued now, and the New York Times has been sued. So I mean, that might be one element. You know, they come back at you hard. And the other thing is that reporters generally, I mean, I felt it at Reuters every single day. Caitlin felt it over her book. I know reporters at the New York Times, others other than Eric, when you write stories that do not reflect favorably on Monsanto or others in the agrochemical industry, and mainly Monsanto. I mean, I would get feedback from Dow and DuPont, and they'd say, yeah, I really didn't like that story, Carey, whatever. Monsanto, they come after you really hard all the time.
And sometimes you don't even know. They're just insidiously doing things that come
And
after
so
you.
if you're a young reporter, I'm an old dog, like they didn't faze me, but if you're a young reporter, I think you would just say, you know what, I don't need the headache. I don't need my editor coming to me saying, why are these people emailing me? What is going on? Why are you doing this? It's hard. And it's hard by design. They want it to be hard. They want you not to write the story that they don't want you to write. So
Yeah. I'll give just, why don't we hear more about this? Monsanto, I mentioned, came in illegally, and the illegal trials also were doing very badly. And I was about the only one talking about their BT cotton and the GMOs. And so there was in a TV channel that asked me to come in and talk about it and explain what GMOs are and what's BT cotton and how is it doing. And they did a whole 1-hour program on national TV. Of course, it was aired, it was live. They got a call saying, don't you dare do a program like this covering these topics ever again. We're going to sue you so much, you're going to shut down.
yeah.
The owners backed off. That's all it takes, a phone call about being sued. For very long, I've had columns in Indian newspapers. And the last one was a newspaper called Asian Age. And I was writing, I think, about the GM mustard. And interestingly, our environment minister, who was topping it, died very, very mysteriously. But this article was written. Asian Age got a call saying, they have to put a full page counter, which was a big advertisement, not an article, about all their future crops. It was not a line about saying what I'd said was not true. And they put a condition. And Asian Age called me and said, Dr. Shiva, either we exist as a paper or we've got to shut down your column. I said, shut down my column.
Yeah.
So this is why you don't hear more.
Right, yeah. I write for magazines now, the newspaper. I was involved in a webinar with the Security and Sustainability Forum that looks at sort of global issues. And every article I write, they go to the editors of those publications and pressure them to not let me write for them again. This webinar with the Security and Sustainability Forum, they were shocked, because they deal with national security questions and things, and they hadn't really explored this issue, and they were shocked. They started getting all of these emails ahead of the webinar, pressure to pull it, to cancel it. Sponsors got a lot of pressure. They do little, they do big, they try to shut it down.
So it is 9:30. There are a lot of hands up, but there are some tired people on the panel. So I want to say that what we just heard, and the pressure and the threats, and I think we've all shared them, except I didn't share mine. Bruce Chassey, who was mentioned here a couple of times, he was paid a lot of money to try and discredit my book, Genetic Roulette, and came up with an entire website with dozens and dozens of pages lying about what my book said in order to fight the book, because the book had taken hold all around the world and was being used as evidence that GMOs were unsafe. So he's not my favorite person, but I might be his, because he got paid a lot of money to try and attack me. So I want to express this, that I would love to hear from you a heartfelt appreciation for what these people on this panel have done to stand up to the truth, to withstand the pressure, and to be here to give you that truth.